Hello and welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat with Helga Zepp-Larouche for Thursday, December 8th. Tonight we are going to do something a bit unusual, but it's because of the circumstances that both the world finds itself in, and our organization finds itself in with respect to our capacities, which have increased significantly, to intervene into the present circumstance. At 3 o'clock, just after 3 o'clock today, on the Judging Freedom show of Judge Napolitano, did an interview with Colonel Douglas McGregor, and in that interview, the following exchange occurred. So Napolitano said to McGregor, yesterday, Secretary of State Tony Blinken told the Wall Street Journal that the United States' public policy is to return Russian troops to the pre-February 24th border, which means that they would be totally out of Ukraine. How realistic is that, and how unwise is it for him to state that as American public policy? So McGregor answered, well, if his intention is to ensure that there can be no negotiations, then he succeeded, because that's unacceptable to the Russians. Perhaps that's the reason he did it. Then in a slightly later exchange, he said, this is the impossible dream. We ought to just forget about it. It's an irrelevant statement. It's unworthy of any attention. So then Judge Napolitano asked this question. He said, you recently commented to me off air about some comments that President Putin made, which were very, very intriguing. I found them intriguing, and I think that the audience will as well. Concerning nuclear weapons, what did President Putin say, and how does it interact with American policy with respect to the use of nukes? So McGregor said the following. Well, as you will recall, in June, he reiterated the policy that under no circumstances would the Russians employ nuclear weapons unless they were attacked by a power that used nuclear weapons against them. What Putin has done now is he said that he has re-examined this, and there are certain reasons. One is, of course, that Biden essentially renounced the no first use approach of his predecessor, meaning Donald Trump, and said that he would now use nuclear weapons against conventional forces, not only against nuclear forces, even if we were not attacked with a nuclear weapon. Okay, so at that point, Judge Napolitano said, let me stop you right now. How reckless is that? McGregor's answer, well, this is the President of the United States who made these statements and signed this new policy into doctrine. It was very ill-advised. I don't know of anybody in Washington who thinks it's a good idea, but that's what's happened. And since then, we've had lots of loose talk from people about tactical nuclear changes and winning limited nuclear wars, that kind of nonsense. Okay, question from Napolitano. But as a result of this policy change, which I don't think was on the front page of the New York Times, but as a result of this policy change, what did President Putin say or do? McGregor, well, let me go one step further. There's one other thing that has occurred which has induced him to change his position. We've placed a lot of aircraft in the theater that are capable of delivering nuclear weapons. And I'm sure that most of your viewers are aware that we do have nuclear weapons on the ground in Germany. So it's not impossible that we could load nuclear bombs into our weapons, nuclear warheads on cruise missiles. And, of course, we have a battle group at sea in the Adriatic or some area nearby. That also has nuclear weapons that can be employed. So what Putin has now said is that we will not simply sit by when we see evidence that the United States or its allies are preparing a first strike against us. In other words, if we detect that you are weaponizing your cruise missiles or aircraft with nuclear weapons, we will no longer sit still and do nothing. We will strike. Of course, that's a very frightening prospect. The potential enemy in Russia is saying we may make the judgment call that you are preparing to nuke us, in which case we will nuke you first. So that occurred today at after 3 o'clock. The importance here is for the persons on the phone call in general to understand and to know that in the United States and around the United States, independent of this organization, there are people that are discussing the fact that the Biden administration changed the nuclear posture of the United States to a policy of utilizing nuclear weapons against non-nuclear powers and in the event of attacks which are done on the United States which are also non-nuclear. That's a complete change in policy. And this was noted consequently. So now what we're going to do tonight is we're going to play you Helga Zepp-Larouche's interview with Vladimir Solovyov. This was on Russia One, which is a internet TV and radio, I guess. This show was done day before yesterday, and we're going to play it in its entirety. Now, the purpose of us doing this is Helga Zepp-Larouche's discussion of her 10 principles and the way in which that discussion evolves. Following that, we have two presenters that we're going to go to, which will be Joel Dejean, and we'll go then to Bill Jones. Okay, so we'll now play that exchange. This is about 20 minutes. What I would ask that people do is to make sure your phones are muted, especially those who are in the host queue for this evening, so that the sound quality will be as good as possible. We've tested it before, but this way we ensure that we get the best possible sound. All right, Charles, it's fine. Go ahead and play it.
Well, unfortunately, that's about my German, so if you don't have anything against it, we'll try English. And sorry if I've been late a couple of minutes. Those Russians, they're never good on time. There's always a problem with the Russians being good on timing. I have to say I was quite impressed with your very tough point of view, should I say that, very revolutionary. Definitely not mainstream of current European political ideas. How come? It looks like the dawn of Europe, the book that has been written more than 100 years ago, suddenly comes true. What are we facing right now? And what should be done in order to save the world?
Well, I think the problem is that we are, as some of the Russian officials have stated recently, we are already at a state of war between NATO and Russia. And that is, many people in many countries are extremely worried that this may lead to nuclear war. And if it would come to that, I don't think that it would be a limited nuclear war. I think regional war or the use of only tactical nuclear weapons, I think this is all ruled out. And if it comes to the use of only one single nuclear weapon, it would have the danger of a global nuclear war, and that would mean the annihilation of civilization. And for me, I think you have to start with that. This is why I have suggested 10 principles for a new international security and development architecture, which is drawing very much on the example of the Peace of Westphalia, which ended 150 years of religious war in Europe. And I'm really fighting very hard to put this on the agenda before it is too late.
So what are those 10 principles, and what makes you think that current political power in Germany, but basically in USA, we realize that whatever is there right now in Germany is just a reflection, it's just another projection of American point of view, that they will hear you, that you won't be punished severely for your point of view, because nowadays it's not even possible to talk about the freedom of speech and the freedom of philosophical ideas in Europe.
I know it's not allowed, and you are being, ostracized immediately and worse. But I think, we are in a situation where, this is not a tenable situation. Germany, for example, has lost presently all of its sovereignty with the present government, at least concerning certain ministers. And, we are running against a collapse in Germany. The economic situation is absolutely devastating. The result of the sanctions which Germany imposed against Russia on orders practically of the United States is boomeranging, and the blowback is threatening the existence of Germany as an industrial nation. So, this will become apparent in the next weeks and months. And I think, we are in an epochal change. It's not just the war between the West and Russia, but, the result of the policies imposed against Russia in particular have led to a counter-reaction. The entire global South is in a revolutionary spirit to establish a just new world economic order. And, this is a revival of the non-aligned movement, which was already on that course in the 70s. And now I think it is unstoppable. You have now the emergence of a completely new system, which, is the BRICS, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union. All of these countries, are reacting to the policies coming, especially from the British and the United States, and they are forming a new world economic order. And, some people may think that it is enough if you have a multipolar world. The unipolar world is definitely over. But I'm of the opinion that even multipolarity is not sufficient, because it still has the potential of a geopolitical confrontation. So this is why I think the most advanced proposal to overcome that in the present world comes from President Xi Jinping, who is talking about the shared community of the future of mankind. And my 10 principles basically are an effort to elaborate principles how we can get people to understand what the new paradigm is in which we have to move. And that is a very deep philosophical conception. I've been working together with my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, on that for the better part of the last 50 years. So I'm convinced that, this is resonating with what the world right now urgently needs, which is a new conception. The question is really, can we as a human civilization give ourselves an order which allows the long-term survivability of our species? So this is the biggest challenge to our intelligence you can have. And since and that's the 10th point of my 10 principles, I'm convinced that man is fundamentally good, and that the evil in the world is the result of a lack of development. So, I'm confident. I think the danger is incredibly big, but on the same time, I'm also extremely optimistic that a solution to this present calamity can be found.
So what are those 10 principles? What are they? How dare you to bring those 10 principles to the world of Schwab, who is saying that humanity is a disease and that better to be without humanity for the world? So how come that nowadays you are coming with basically, let's say, humanitarian tradition of understanding humanity, instead of modern liberal Nazi view, where basically humanity should be destroyed?
Well, I think the present world order in large part suffers from the problem of oligarchism. That is not a new phenomena. You had empires, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Venetian Empire, the British Empire, which in one sense still exists. And these forms of government were based on the idea that you have a small, powerful elite, sometimes the aristocrats, sometimes the financial elites, and that they have all the privileges and rule over backward masses of people. That system is the origin of what former president of Czech Republic, Václav Klaus, calls the green delirium, which is the idea that we are living in a world of finite resources, that, you have to have management of scarcity and all of this. But that's not the real universe. I mean, the good thing is that man is different from animals because we are capable of discovering universal principles about the physical universe. This is called scientific and technological progress.
Right.
And when we apply that progress in the production process, then it leads to an increase of the living standard, the longevity of people. And, so I think we have reached now a point where, the evolution of mankind is at a point where we have to adjust the political and economic order to the actual lawfulness of the physical universe if we want to survive. And that is not a new idea. This was actually, a philosophical conception in Europe. It was called natural law. You have the same idea in other cultures. In India, for example, it's called cosmology, where basically politics is supposed to implement the lawfulness of the cosmos. You have the same idea in Chinese philosophy with the mandate of heavens. So, in all great cultures, you have this idea that there is a higher lawfulness which we have to respect or bring about, destruction. So I think we have really reached, I think we are in a very optimistic change of an epoch. I would call it, that mankind is about to reach the age of adulthood.
That's very optimistic, should I say. But by reaching this age of adult, we have to face quite new challenges. One of them is that Europe is basically put an iron curtain by trying to recognize Russia as a sponsor of terrorism state. They are just cutting all possible ties that have been left. And it's leading us to completely new scenario. Europe without Russia is basically a very small place.
Well, I mean, right now, the mainstream media and the major political parties as they are represented in the European Parliament, which made this resolution about Russia being a terrorist state, I mean, that is the surface, and, it looks, if you only look at the mass media, you get the impression that that is everything there is. But we are organizing people. Look, there are demonstrations in all European countries to end the war, to have a peaceful negotiation, use diplomacy already. And, many people are demonstrating in East Germany, in Belgium, in France, in Italy, even in Great Britain. So, I think that this is a very dangerous moment, obviously. But I think that as the crisis will become bigger and you have hyperinflation, the energy prices, the food prices, I think we are heading towards a very big moment of decision. And what the Schiller Institute is trying to do is we are organizing international conferences which have to be virtual because of the still existing pandemic condition. And we are trying to bring together people from all over the world. I have initiated something which is called the Movement of World Citizen. Friedrich Schiller, I should explain. Friedrich Schiller, after whom the Schiller Institute is named, had the idea that there must not be a contradiction between patriots and world citizens. So given the fact that the danger of nuclear war makes everybody instantly a world citizen because the whole world is challenged, so I have called for a world citizens movement. And since I'm born in Trier, which some people may recognize the importance of that, I have called for the world citizens of all countries unite, which I find a certain irony. But many people have responded. We had 3 conferences already with a lot of sitting and former parliamentarians and former ministers and presidents from Latin America, who have issued a call to all parliamentarians and elected officials of the world to join this movement and fight for essentially, these 10 principles and the new security and development architecture.
So you're still an optimist? You still think that humanity is going to survive?
Oh, yes. I mean, obviously the danger is enormous, because if it comes to nuclear war, there will not be even a historian left to investigate the reasons why it came to this point. So I'm not unaware of the incredible danger. But, I believe that, the majority of the world is already creating a new system. The BRICS countries already have a GDP which is higher than that of the G7. And you saw at the recent G20 meeting that, despite incredible pressure, the majority of the countries of the global south do not want to change sides. Even the Trilateral Commission, which is really a not exactly, my kind of organization. The Japanese representative of the Trilateral Commission just recently said, telling the United States and Great Britain, do not force us to choose sides between China and the United States, because if we are forced, we will choose China. This came from Japanese Trilateral Commission members. So the spirit is really not, people do not want this geopolitical confrontation any longer. And, I think that there is a tremendous chance. Look, Modi, who will chair the G20 in the coming year, just made a very beautiful speech where he echoed essentially what I'm saying, that, there are people who say that man is evil, but he says, no, the fact that there are so many aspirations in religion and philosophy, that man is fundamentally good, and I think that with the leadership of India in the G20, you will see that the global south will have a much greater voice. And, we are trying to convince people in the United States and in Europe to join with that new system rather than trying to oppose it. And, okay, maybe that will not function, but I'm optimistic that it's the only choice, because we have to get the United States and Europe to cooperate with the countries of the global south and China. And if the United States and China, which are the two largest economies of the world, are not working together, then, no problem of the world can be solved. On the other side, if we succeed in showing, that there is an advantage for everybody to solve poverty. I mean, poverty should be eliminated. It is the biggest violation of human rights you can imagine. So all I want to say is that what we are proposing is actually in cohesion with the wishes and desires of the majority of the world population.
Well, but how can you imagine those guys in US, in UK, in Germany giving up the complex of superiority, where they still consider other part of humanity, according to Kipling, half beast, half humans, as in the burden of the white man. So how can you imagine Americans suddenly recognize that they're not the chosen nation? They won't come with it. They don't want to do it. No one ever gave up the complex of superiority before being defeated. There's no brain to apply to. Look at Biden. There's no brain to apply to. There's a number of stereotypes. And that's about it.
Yeah, but, look, Joseph Borrell from the EU made this incredible statement that the EU is a beautiful garden.
Yeah, surrounded by jungle, yeah.
And that made him the laughingstock of the whole world,
Yeah, but he's an idiot that represents diplomacy over you. What kind of idiot right now represents the EU as the top diplomat? That's annoying.
Yeah, but, in a sense, you have to laugh about it, as many of the countries of the global south are doing. I mean, the countries of the developing sector are right now in a mood where they recognize that this is the effort to keep the colonial order, but that is not look, all of these countries have a different tradition. The United States, for example, made their independence in the War of Independence against the British Empire. And the Constitution of the United States was the first real republic in the history of mankind. And if you look at the principles of Benjamin Franklin, of George Washington, of John Quincy Adams exactly said what we are saying today, that you need a partnership of perfectly sovereign republics, and the United States should not go out and look for foreign monsters. Then Lincoln had the same idea. Franklin D. Roosevelt designed when he designed the Bretton Woods system, it was meant as the first priority to overcome underdevelopment of the developing countries. So even Kennedy, had a beautiful idea about the role of technology would solve all the poverty in the third world. So there is a tradition in the United States which is completely different. The problem with the United States right now is that they have adopted the model of the British Empire as the basis to rule the world in an unipolar world, in an unipolar style. But that is not the whole United States. I mean, the people of the United States essentially are good. It is what some people call the Mickey match. Ray McGovern, who is it's the military-industrial complex plus the Congress, plus the media, plus the Silicon Valley, but that is a small minority. They look like the all-powerful force right now, but I think this other tradition of America is there, and we are trying very hard to make a revival of the best traditions of the United States.
I hope that you succeed. I hope you succeed. Unfortunately, the time is running out. And excuse my smile. The reason is that my wife's name is Helga Zepp. So when I say Helga Zepp, I feel like talking to a relative. Should I say?
That's funny.
Yeah, that's quite unusual, should I say. And I love what you're saying. And I love your very sweet, idealistic, but very thought-through, based on the belief that humans are better than they are theory. The only minor thing is, the founding fathers of the United States, that were all about democracy and human rights, should we say, they all owned slaves. So their definition of free man were only for wasp. And that's what makes us Russians being so careful when we're dealing with the West. Definition of every word. Just to be sure that to understand words the same way. In any other case, we're running into problems all the time. It was a pleasure, and I hope to continue our discussions in the coming future. Спасибо вам большое. Я благодарю Helga.
All right. So that was 2 days ago, and that is one portion of our intervention into Russia. Obviously, we've been in a dialogue with Russia for a long, long time, but I don't believe that Helga Zepp-Larouche had the opportunity to talk directly to the Russian people, the English-speaking section of the Russian people, but that's a large number of people, and certainly those are the people who have, shall we say, the greatest contact with countries in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere. Now, there's a second portion to this, and we're going to hear about that a little bit later from Bill Jones. Bill was a primary organizer of a recent November 12th conference that was done by the Schiller Institute, and it involved our kind of, and we've been involved for many years in reviving the heritage of the great physicist and founder of biogeochemistry, Vladimir Vernadsky, who was Russian and Ukrainian. And we're going to get to that because that's the other way in which we're intervening. But before we go to that, I've asked that Joel Dejean, former candidate for Congress down in Texas, say a few things about what other elements of the situation you were not hearing about. And we're doing all this, let me just say, if you just joined, because you may have come on, some people did join, after we were playing that interview with Mr. Vladimir Solovyov of Russia. and this is on what's called Russia 1, is what we're doing is we are presenting the discussion of Helga Zepp-Larouche's 10 principles, how she did it, how she does it with people in circumstances where she's talking to somebody. Remember, this is a Russian talking to a German. You have to just, if you know the history, there are two different histories there. One of real cooperation and one of very, very serious warfare. Remember that the Battle of Stalingrad alone saw 2 million people killed in a single battle. Okay, the biggest battles in human history, the greatest casualties occurred as those battles fought between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The decisive battles actually of World War II were fought on the Eastern Front in that respect. So you have to understand what kind of history is being brought by those two speakers, to that discussion. So what I'd like to do is have Joel go now and say a few things about his perception, both of what's happening and also about this issue of the 10 principles. So, Joel?
Thank you, Dennis. Yesterday, December 7th, was the 81st anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, a day that will live in infamy, but it was also the 50th anniversary of the launching of Apollo 17, the last manned mission that landed on the moon. And one of the astronauts, Harrison Schmitt, who walked on the moon, who was the first geologist, and he also ran for the U.S. Senate and was a U.S. Senator in the early 80s. And I did get to speak to him a few times during some of his lectures on his experience. He would give lectures in the Houston area to space enthusiasts. This was before COVID. Now, the three great spacefaring nations all have men in space, men and women now. China just rotated a crew to their space station. They had 6 astronauts on board, and 3 of them who were up there for 6 months just came back just a couple of days ago. The International Space Station has been occupied by Americans and cosmonauts and Europeans and Japanese over the last 22 years continuously. That's still going on. And now we have Artemis 1. The Orion capsule is about to land. It was an uncrewed mission to the moon, and it's coming back, scheduled to land up San Diego on Sunday, December 11th. Now, it was uncrewed, but NASA put 3 or 4 dummies in there for testing. Now, it's not known which congressmen were picked for that mission, but we'll find out Sunday. So we're not starting from ground zero. Now, what I want to touch on is the 9th principle, Helga's 9th principle, which involves physical principles like space and thermonuclear fusion. Now, it turns out that when Harrison Schmitt and his crew came back from the moon, they had, after 3 days on the moon's surface, 243 pounds of moon rocks and moon soil. And it wasn't until about 10 years after they landed that it was discovered that the moon's soil, the regolith, contains a very valuable element, helium-3, which would be the perfect second-generation fusion fuel. Now, if you heard Linda LaRouche's speeches over the last, starting about 12 years ago every speech he would bring up the use of helium-3 or fusion rockets. And work on that is going on continuously. Now, if you look at what these three nations bring to the table, the U.S., which is prevented by law from working with China, should rescind that law and work with China. We are already working with Russia, even with all the difficulties of this ongoing war provoked by NATO. And if you look at the work on fusion, there's a lot of work going on, not only with the experiment in southern France, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, but there was another breakthrough a couple of months ago at the National Ignition Facility, where about a year ago, they achieved 70% break-even. And just a couple of months ago, they achieved 63% break-even. And I can go through that, what that means later. But you have China, Russia, the European Union, Japan, Korea, all working on the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. And I'm sure Bill will go through what China just did the other day. They have an experimental magnetic reactor, a tokamak, and they disassembled it and they donated it to Thailand. Now, you compare that to what the U.S. and the United Kingdom have been doing. Instead of donating experimental apparatus for other nations to develop their scientific and engineering capabilities, the U.S. is donating a nuclear attack submarine so that Australia could become a menace, an aircraft carrier, so to speak, to threaten China. So that's just touching on the ninth principle that Helga has gone through. Now, the seventh principle is how we need to get rid of or ban not only nuclear weapons, but weapons of mass destruction. You might think, well, that's impossible. But as Helga hints, that the key to that is a scientific breakthrough around what LaRouche Linden called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or that's what Reagan termed it. And if you look at what's going on again in space, if you look at the images from the James Webb Telescope, the prime contractor for the James Webb Telescope is Northrop Grumman. And you might have noticed a few days ago, the prime contractor for the latest stealth bomber, they call it the sixth generation bomber, the B-21, was rolled out in Edwards Air Base in California. And this bomber is supposed to be able to penetrate any radar or air defenses and drop nuclear bombs on Russia. Now, each plane is scheduled to cost over $600 million apiece, for a total of $200 billion. Now, if companies like Northrop Grumman, Lockheed, Raytheon, other defense contractors were brought in on a crash program, not only to go back to the moon, but to develop the moon, develop the helium-3 resources, develop fusion propulsion, and eventually go on to Mars, like LaRouche laid out in his 1988 30-minute TV special for his presidential campaign, The Woman on Mars. Those companies, and I can guarantee you all the engineers and scientists working for those companies would much rather work on things like the James Webb and a Moon-Mars mission than on new ways to develop thermonuclear bombs to blow up the world. So if you look at those two principles, we're not starting from ground zero. There's a lot that's been developed. There's a lot going on behind the scenes. but we have to accelerate these programs. And if we do that, that will not only give us a future, but it would give youth a reason to study and a reason to determine what and how to determine the truth. Because once you get into space, it's not a matter of an opinion poll. When NASA goes into orbit, they don't take a poll to say, what is the orbital velocity that we're going to achieve? They don't take a poll when they're going to the moon to say, well, how fast do we need to be going to escape Earth's orbit? These are based on physical principles. And that's what children should be learning instead of how to make TikTok videos or how to get the millions of likes. What they should be learning is how to become a participant in making man an extraterrestrial species, like what Prof. Erica called for, like what LaRouche called for, and what mankind should be doing instead of plotting on how to make weapons to destroy the enemy. So I'll stop there.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot, Joel. Very good. So, Bill, if you're there, please go right ahead.
I'd like to say just a few things about the reaction of Mr. Solovyov is probably more common than one would think on the Russian side, although it's not universal. That you can imagine that there are people who have been continually bombarded from the West, both propaganda-wise and also physically, in the Ukrainian situation, that they are not worth anything. They're not worth listening to. Their concerns are not of concerns of other people. We don't have to pay attention to them. It becomes very depressing and they become very angry. But everybody is not as pessimistic as Solovyov is about the West, although they don't understand it as well as we do. And of course, we know what the situation is. We know that the imperial impulse is not something native to Americans. It's not something in our culture, but it's been something that has been imposed upon us from the outside. Whereas if the American people would start to wake up, they would revert to their own traditions, which were traditions of cooperation, most closely with cooperation with Russia since the beginning of the American Revolution. And that, as soon as that becomes known, then we have a different type of situation. And I think the reason for the optimism also that Helga is showing is not only a philosophical optimism, but it's also a realization, as she also indicated, of where the world is going. We have seen just over the past few days the top advisor to President Putin, Yuri Ushakov, who said, we are now living in a new world where the principles of this, I would say the international liberal system are no longer valid. And at a conference that was dedicated to former Premier and Foreign Minister Primakov. And I think that gives the confidence in both the Russians and in other people that the world is moving in a different direction. It is moving in the direction in which we and Lynn have indicated it should move into, partially and to a great extent in the case of Russia, most specifically, but also with regard to China as a result of what he has said over all these many years with regard to the need for a change in the way the world system operates. We see this also most recently in the last day or two with this meeting that President Xi Jinping is going to be having with 40 Arab leaders. And here we have Saudi Arabia. Remember, Saudi Arabia, our big friend, giving us the oil and working with them closely, military ties up to the Yazoo. What can I say about that? They are now saying, look, we want to work with China. We want Chinese visitors. They want tourism from China. But they're also getting other things. They're getting, China's building oil refineries in Saudi Arabia. They're part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and they're not going to leave that. China has built, and this is also, I think, in tandem with their idea that, you can't try and change other cultures. You have to understand what those cultures are and bring out the best in them. And what the Chinese have done, every year there is this international, every Muslim sometime during his lifetime should go to Mecca to worship. And what the Chinese have done is they built a high-speed rail from Medina to Mecca. So you can get to Saudi Arabia. You don't have to make this long trek, several days trek to Mecca. You can take a high-speed rail. And that's also kind of a sign of respect of the culture, which is a part of the BRI tradition. So the situation is changing rapidly. The purpose of our Vernadsky conference was also to send a message, or to try and put out a message to the Russians by underlining the importance of this great scientist of world stature, even more than a revolutionary scientist, revolutionary world stature. And I'll mention some things about that revolutionary nature of his work in a bit, because it brings out the sense of pride in the Russians. And with anybody from the West doing that is also a signal that all is not lost, that there is hope here. And we had and we intended to have both Americans and people from other nationalities as well as Russians to speak there. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend you go take a look at the video. Most of the speeches will be, or either have been or will be presented. But the most important, I think, is to make the point that I want to make here is the two Russian speakers, Professor Voyakov and Pulinets, both of whom are, the top in their field, one in the Department of Biology and another in space research, especially with regard to earthquake detection. But they were told, this is going to be about Vernadsky, and if you could say anything about Vernadsky in relationship to the field you're working in, and Vernadsky worked in both of these fields, or many different, almost all the fields related to the earth sciences, you should do that. And the presentations they gave were absolutely excellent. I mean, Professor Voyakov pointed out the one aspect of Vernadsky's heritage, which was the notion of life, which is part of the revolutionary nature, the notion that life is probably as much with us as energy and matter, that it didn't come out of this global mix, through chemical reactions, but that it's something different, that is an entirely different state of space than inert or non-living matter, and can never come out of it. And he did that not as a basis, Vernadsky said this, not as a basis of philosophical belief. It's because as a scientist, he knew that it has never been found in all geological time that life has been created out of non-life. And so it's a scientific fact, or what he calls a scientific generalization, which is valid because of the proof of there's no proof of the opposite whatsoever in all of geological history. And he underlined that point, which is interesting because this is not what is generally believed in biological science. And people who have studied biology know that that's not the case. There's all kinds of, schemes that are put up of how, life comes out of this mix of the protoplasm develops out of this mix, the chemical mix in some, mysterious way, and they figure out, aspects of that. But, Vernadsky denied that, and this is generally not accepted within biology, not even in biology in Russia, I believe. So that the fact that Voyakov took that up was extremely interesting because, he felt that this is something that has not been, accepted generally, but it was lay at the basis of what Vernadsky was doing. Pulinets, I think, was very interesting because he actually, I know he knows Vernadsky. They know about Vernadsky, but they don't know him because they didn't study him. in schools. I mean, his name is known, his work is known to some extent, but nobody does a serious study in the high schools and universities in Moscow on this issue. And he went to his bookcase, and he looked in his bookcase for a biography he had about Vernadsky, and read it before he gave his speech, so he could make some personal references that were of interest about his family and Vernadsky's family, going back to the 16th century, where they're from the same district, which was extremely interesting. But more importantly, he focused on this notion, which is also a part of the revolutionary thought of Vernadsky, that the biosphere that we have here is a galactic phenomena, that the real source of it comes from the galaxy, including life, and that is through this cosmic energy that exists within the galactic forces which created this and remain as a force within the Earth itself. He was the first one to point out the fact that it's these nuclear reactions, the nuclear energy that is in the Earth itself provides more warmth to the Earth than even the sun. And he also had the idea that you have to look at this. It was the beginning of the atomic era, and he was one of the first to pick up on that, which is why he went into a study not of the molecular biology, as they call it, but of the atomic nature of living matter, to try and determine what is this thing, how does it work, how is it different from non-living matter, and what effect does it have. And what Poulin has indicated, that because of this, Vernadsky realized that there was radon that through the cosmic rays exist in the Earth's surface, and the atmosphere above it, or the geospheres above it, the stratosphere included, also have atomic contacts amongst themselves with the atoms under the Earth. And as a result of this, you can now predict, which is Poulin's job, is to predict earthquakes by seeing changes in the stratosphere, which are being affected by what is going on underneath the Earth, so that you have a lead time there in the effects in the atmosphere. That is generally not accepted either, even among some of the other so-called earthquake people. Poulin also had a contract in Slovenia to do their earthquake predictions, and some hedge fund company, which has a computer model for the movements in the Earth, saying that this is all nonsense that Poulin is doing about the stratosphere, so we can do it better, and so that they got this contract. But I think they're going to have a tougher time with earthquakes in Slovenia as a result of that. But it's because all of this is absolutely very new. A lot of it has been implemented in terms of the earthquake prediction, but it's generally not known. Vernadsky himself, the other thing that we had in reactions to this is there have been quite a few of Russian scholars, Russian intellectuals, scientists, and others in the professions, who have responded specifically by sending into Schiller Institute greetings or comments, excuse me, with regard to the seminar. And some of them have been contacts for many years. Some of one in fact had actually met with Lynn and Helga at some time, but they kind of were, and they've been there for a while, but they kind of were revived. They were touched by the fact that this is not just the ordinary stuff that we're doing about the political situation, but it has something to do with Vernadsky, and this is something for them which was extremely important. So I think one of the things we wanted to do, of course, as was indicated, in the seminar, to make Vernadsky's known, his thought and his work known more in the West, but it also has an effect in Russia itself. because although he is known as a major scientist, his name is on the Institute of Geochemistry in Moscow. There are statues to him. There is general recognition of him on his anniversaries. Now next year is the 160th anniversary of his birth. There obviously will be some celebrations of sort, even I think under the present circumstances, maybe of a smaller nature. But he's recognized, but they still, it's just more a name and a figure of importance. But they don't really have understood the nature of his thought because of this idea that because he was active in the Soviet Union, where dialectical materialism was dominant. And dialectical materialism is materialism. And the materialist doctrine says that life is a result of a certain combination of these chemicals of these atoms which produce, living protoplasm. And so that was the accepted doctrine. So that Vernadsky, although he was the most significant scientific figure in the Soviet Union and recognized as such, all of these ideas were suppressed, including writings that some of which we have now translated, which he wanted translated in English in 1945 by the Russians. He wanted them translated. He wanted them published in Russian and English because he thought it was so important to get these things out. But it was never done because some of the ideas in it were considered non-kosher in terms of the dialectical materialism. And as a matter of fact, in the 1960s, the Russians made a foreign policy issue of presenting the notion of abiogenesis under the form of the so-called scientist Oparin to the world community, which was embraced by the United Nations and became a part of their own doctrine. And therefore, the Vernadsky thing had to be totally suppressed. But he wrote this, two things that I think are important. One is this role of life. I mean, the question is, what is science going to look like if it is the case? And Vernadsky at the time, he said, life has to be, really everywhere in the universe. And of course, at that time in the 1940s, this wasn't generally accepted. We didn't know that. We had no idea to determine that, but he believed that was the case because of his understanding of how the Earth had developed and the fact that life cannot come from non-life, and it had to be a galactic formation. And of course, now we know that is the case. Everybody is looking for, life on the moon, life on Mars, so that confirmed to a large extent some of his views on this. But the overall idea that if life is always present, and it must be, I mean, if it doesn't come from non-life, whereas it must have been there the whole time. And Vernadsky even made comments about this, that, we know that energy, matter, that's something that's always been a part of the universe, but he's saying maybe it was energy, matter, and life. We're all kind of floating around there for probably, who knows, infinity. That would be very shocking. We'd have to go back and look at, a lot of the stuff that Newton and others are doing to figure out, hey, maybe we haven't had the right idea whatsoever. The second thing I think is important is this idea that he talked about the states of space. He said, basing his work initially on what Pasteur had found about this, left-handedness of living matter as opposed to, having the dual nature, right and left, symmetry, which you find in non-living matter, and which is coherent with Euclidean geometry, which of course the left-handedness is complicated, is not consistent with Euclidean geometry. So Vernadsky had to look, he was looking to study this. Pasteur's work had been taken up by Pierre Curie, who began studying this notion of the left-handedness, and he didn't call it disymmetry, which it was generally known as in crystallography, which both Pasteur and Curie were also crystallographers, and that's how they discovered this phenomenon, how they interpreted this phenomenon. But he called it a different state of space. That is, life is existing in a different state of space. Wow, what does this mean? What do you mean a different state of space? And for Vernadsky, this was, and Vernadsky said, as Lynn has said with economics, it had the same kind of a problem. He says, look, we have this so-called economics, Eulerian economics. It is totally smooth and continuous and just kind of grows, and there's no big jumps or anything like. And that's consistent with Euclidean geometry. But of course, when you get to the notion of technological breakthroughs and abrupt discoveries which change the whole nature, the whole symmetry of the whole shape of the state of nature of economics, then you've got a different kind of situation which isn't explained by this Euclidean geometry. And so then, as Vernadsky said, it had to be a part, in their own fields, this has to be a part of Riemannian geometry. It can't be explained by it. Oh, now what does this mean? I mean, this is a whole era. I mean, look at economics. Lynn developed the LaRouche-Riemann model, which we have to dust off a little bit now, to understand, because the state of nature, if Vernadsky and if Lynn are correct in this, that reality is really kind of discontinuous in a very particular way, in a directed sort of way. We have to understand what these discontinuities, how they work. And you can't do that with Euclidean geometry. So it requires a whole different mindset in kind of moving in this direction. And for Vernadsky, he felt
Bill, hold on. I don't want to interrupt you. This has been good. Just try to summarize and get a couple of questions in before we conclude. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. All right. Let me just get to the last part. It's the fact of the last book that Vernadsky wrote, which was a large torso, because he didn't get the last chapter. The last chapter was going to be on the noosphere, that is the role of man in the universe. So it's kind of a big loss, but the torso that exists is absolutely fascinating. And Vernadsky himself, he compared it, probably giving Newton too much credit, to the Principia Mathematica, which is supposed to have been, the be-all of worldview at the time, and Humboldt's Cosmos, which Vernadsky had read as a student, as a high school student in German. And it is a view of the universe based on the notion of the eternal nature of life and how it works in creating and developing the planets. This is, if it were ever published, it was published in Russian, and it kind of is gathering dust at the moment. I think that would be a major revolutionary breakthrough, which would require people to go back to the work table to figure out, what is reality as we know it actually, in terms of what we now know is the truth. And I think there are people there in Russia who want to do that. A number of people who responded on that, one of whom is the most important, I would say, the doyen of the Vernadsky scholars in Russia, whom I knew also for many years, haven't been in touch with him. But at this conference, he reacted to messages and he indicated what he's trying to do to make Vernadsky known to the Russian public, to the Russian intellectual public. So this will obviously dovetail to some extent with what we're trying to do here. But it's very exciting stuff. And I think in the light of the shift in the world situation towards this community of interest, a community of common interest of mankind, that these kind of ideas you'd have to implement and inculcate in that this new idea of looking at science from the standpoint of Vernadsky as we move into the galaxy, which he had been looking at very closely in the last years of his life. So it's some very exciting stuff that I think we just touched the surface of this, and will probably be more to come as we go into the next year, which is an anniversary year.